So I've been doing a bit of thinking about pacing for ultra endurance events, bikepacking events and that type of thing. I think this probably really mainly applies to cycling because the fatigue mechanisms in running are a bit different to what they are in cycling. So what I did is I looked at the power data for two cyclists that I coached. I've got the first 2 days from two multi-day events, and it's quite, they both show similar things. But I was quite surprised at how much time they're spending at high intensity, and that's got certain implications for both training and pacing during events. Anyway, today I want to talk about pacing during the events. And this is the first day of the first person's ride, and you can see it's quite variable. And what it does is I've split it up into training zones. So what's interesting is they're spending quite a lot of time in the higher zones. You can see here the light blue is the endurance zone. The green would be the tempo zone. So you can see actually there's quite a lot of time in the tempo training zone, and also quite a lot of time in the sweet spot and then threshold. And then if we look at the second day, it's quite similar, but there's a bit less time in the higher zones, but there's still a significant amount of time in the tempo zone and above, so well above this endurance zone. And then if you look at the other race, this is a different athlete. This is day one for that athlete, and the scales are a bit different, but what we're really looking at is the time in zones. And you can see that she's also spending over an hour in sweet spot, threshold, and the zone 5, the above threshold zone, and nearly 2 hours in the tempo zone. And then it goes on to the second day. It's a bit less variable, similar to the first athlete, but there's still a significant amount of time in this 40 minutes in sweet spot, another 20 minutes, that's an hour, and 6 minutes above threshold, which is an hour and 6 minutes. And then if you're looking at the tempo zone, that's over 2 hours in tempo. So what this means is they're spending a significant amount of time burning glycogen as a fuel source. So we all burn a combination of fat and glycogen, carbohydrates. And the higher intensity we ride at, the higher proportion of glycogen that we use. So up until somewhere in your training zone 2, in your endurance training zone, you're using primarily fat as an energy source, and then that starts to change as you get above your aerobic threshold, your first ventilatory turning point, and then you start to burn more carbohydrates, and this reserve of carbohydrates is limited. So what this means is that you can use this to improve your performance over a given distance. You can ride harder on the climbs, maybe stay in your endurance training zone on the flat, and then recover on downhills. And if you follow something like that, then you can be more efficient, because it's more efficient to ride the climbs a little bit harder and the descents a little bit easier, because of the way wind resistance works. It's the slower you go, it's better to ride harder the slower you're going, if that makes sense, because you've got less wind resistance. Obviously, how hard you can go on the climbs and how effectively you can recover at lower speeds is very dependent on you. But it means that you can train to do it, and you can also, by practicing different strategies, you can learn to optimize your riding. And you can also make sure that you're not riding hard on the downhills or on the flats, because if you've got this in mind, you can make sure you've got a good pacing strategy and an effective way to ride your event. So you can look at the course profile and make a plan, plan to ride certain parts of the course at certain intensities. And this is obviously maybe a little bit easier if you're using a power meter, but bear in mind that your thresholds change as you get tired. So understanding what it feels like to ride in the appropriate zones is just as perhaps effective as relying on a power meter. So, but a combination of that and power and perceived exertion is probably the most effective. Once you get well into an event, an endurance event like this, then heart rate is very unreliable because it doesn't respond as normal when you're tired. But what you can do is use your heart rate monitor to learn learn what it feels like. So you've got the perception of what it feels like to ride at the varying intensities. And then when you're in your event, you can work on this perceived exertion, which is what a lot of the people I work with do. They're not using power meters on their outside bike. They sometimes use a watt bike or a smart trainer indoors for the higher intensity interval sessions, but outdoors they're learning what perceived exertion works for them. And thinking about your pacing strategy is obviously going to potentially make quite a big difference to your performance. But this is very personal. It's going to be very personal to you, and it's also going to be dependent on what you're eating while you're riding and the time of your stops, what you eat during your recovery, your overnight stops and things like that. So you need to practice it in training before trying it in a race. Don't just go off and think, right, I'm going to ride all these hills at tempo and I'll be okay, because you probably won't be. You need to test it all and train yourself to be able to absorb large amounts of carbohydrates to replenish your glycogen reserves, and also eat the food in a form that your body can tolerate, because gastrointestinal problems are often a deal breaker in long events. People have to drop out often due to gastrointestinal problems. So practice it in training. So what we've learned is that well-trained endurance cyclists can go well above their endurance zone, well above their aerobic threshold, and burn carbohydrates, glycogen reserves, and replenish the glycogen reserves during an event. And due to that, it's possible to have a pacing strategy that takes advantage of these periods of higher intensity and plan recovery accordingly, and then practice a nutritional strategy that replenishes your glycogen reserves as effectively as possible. And that should mean you can ride at an optimal pace during your event. Next time we'll talk about training strategies, how to manipulate training to try and improve your ability to recover from harder efforts during big events, and what nutrition might work for you, and as a consequence you might be able to get even better at following this type of protocol and improve your performance in long events. So hope this makes sense. If you want to see the next video, get a reminder, subscribe to the channel please, and if you found this useful, please give it a like, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.